Yeah, so at Robert Bray Associates, all we do is SuDS design, and we really specialise in SuDS design that performs in terms of sort of flows and volumes, but gives a little bit more back to the community and to the landscape and to wildlife. But just to step aside a little bit from SuDS for a moment to a sort of design commodity that we all know very well, houses. Houses need to meet certain numerical criteria. Things like the number and sizes of rooms, structural integrity, certain energy efficiency standards. But if we designed houses just to these standards alone, we'd probably have very boring houses. And we all know we don't design houses to those criteria alone. People like architects and designers, they add something else to those functional requirements, something a bit less tangible, livability, beauty, feeling. They design in the use and the pleasure of living in houses, sometimes to unusual results. Similarly, SuDS has its functional aspects. Very important, as Anthony pointed out. We've got flows, volumes. In Theo's presentation, looking at treatment, which that clean water also supports biodiversity. So these are things that SuDS systems need to achieve. There are numerical criteria which we need to meet with our SuDS systems. But if we designed SuDS purely to those criteria, they would be very boring spaces. So what we're particularly interested in is beyond those functional aspects, how do we bring in the use and the pleasure into SuDS design? What we call amenity as landscape architects. So a term that's bandied around quite a lot. I like to think at Robert Bray Associates we put the funk back in functionalism. In this example, not satisfied with just plain old rainwater pipes, we looked to do something a bit more interesting. So we had that rain coming out of the rainwater pipes across slides, which the children in this particular school who have various disabilities and learning difficulties are able to have a sensory experience every time it rains, and it's quite a popular feature when it rains. At the same time, we're creating something that visually, even when it's not raining, it suggests a movement of water. It looks interesting and it looks stimulating. So, what is amenity? Well, a dictionary definition, desirable and useful feature, building or place, pleasant, attractive. These are all words which are quite hard to quantify. We can't really put numbers to those to tell whether we've achieved it or not. That in the same way that we can for flows and volumes. These are much more subjective. Part of the reason for this is that amenity is as diverse as we are. At this stage in preparing my presentation, I searched Google Images for an image that summed up the diversity of humankind. This is what it came up with. I quickly found another one which is a bit more appropriate. But if we just take the population of this country alone, incredibly diverse in so many ways, not just ethnically and culturally, but in our interests, our hobbies, our professions, and similarly, the way we use our external spaces, landscapes, differ enormously. There are so many ways in which we use landscapes for pleasure, for social functions, cultural functions, play. I mean, a lot of people think amenity is really just about play, about children, but so much of the way we use external spaces is adults. Even if it's just admiring the beauty or admiring nature, that is all amenity. Art, street dance on the left-hand side. It's not someone trying to pull down his trousers in public. He is dancing. So art and culture. Spirituality even in our parks, Tai Chi, music, doing crazy things, some crazy activities that people do, like Velcro suits, and throwing yourself at Velcro walls so you stick, all these sorts of things that we do in parks and in village fates. And quite often water plays a part in amenity. especially amongst children, but also adults like seeing water move through landscapes. There's a long history of classical garden design and contemporary urban plazas using water as a visual amenity, not just as a play resource. We believe that any landscape, no matter where it is really, any landscape that people are going to experience in some way deserves consideration of those people and how they're going to experience that space. And we believe that any landscape deserves the designer trying to create a more interesting and positive experience for people using that site. Before SuDS came along, people weren't really connected to the surface water system. By the time it went into a pipe, it's forgotten about. After that, most people don't know what happens to that water, which is, I think, why something like Theo's image of the fish held by a boom on the River Lee, people don't know that happens. That wasn't an industrial accident. It wasn't a chemical spill into the river. That was just a summer storm washing pollutants off roads and killing thousands of fish. Because it goes into a pipe, we've lost that connection of where our pollutants go and the damages it does to our natural environment. So before SuDS came along, this really was the sort of our connection with the surface water system, with things like gullies, channel drains, rainwater pipes, slot drains, almost trying to hide away the drainage function to a minimal entity in the environment, almost embarrassed of its existence. Sometimes quite ugly manhole covers, and sometimes, again, we try and hide those covers away. In the past, we used to ornament our manhole covers, or even start to tell people what its function was, start telling them that there was a storm drain down there. We don't know how deep or where it goes, but it's a start. But the SuDS landscape, it brings, presuming we design at or near the surface, which is perceived as best practice, we would support that. SuDS, bringing water to the surface, it can only influence that landscape. It can only change people's experience of that landscape. It will have an impact on that landscape. Here's an example of a low-flow channel we designed at Hotwood Motorway Services. It's probably some 15 years on. It looks like a natural stream now. So we've used SuDS to create actually quite a beautiful environment that looks very natural. So SuDS impacts on its host landscape in terms of how it looks. As we walk through that landscape, we will hear new sounds. It might feel different underfoot. We will have a different topography as we move through. There may be more texture in planting, and there will be potentially sounds of wildlife. But it also brings a new meaning to that landscape. Suddenly we've got a kind of functional aspect threading its way through the site, which creates a sort of form of connectivity. There's a connective thread as the water moves through the landscape, but it also can interact with the accessibility connection of the space, and it will affect the usability of the space that the SuDS system runs through. If it's not designed properly, all these aspects will be negative. The SuDS will influence the landscape in a negative way. This case in Gloucester, the SuDS design was designed through pipes and end a pipe system into a basin, and I'm pretty confident that when this scheme went into planning, this little pocket park here in the middle of housing probably went into planning as a public open space. By rights, looking at the amount of housing around it, I would expect that would be the allocation of public open space for that area. Originally, when it was built, it had a low post and rail fence, so there was public accessibility to the space. But pretty quickly, people realised because the SuDS had been designed so badly, we ended up with a very deep basin with very steep sides, with deep water. So before too long, I had to hold the camera up to take this photo, to take it over the fence. That's about a 1.8 metre high railing, with signs saying "Danger, keep out." We've created a completely sterile space that the community can't use. So it's completely detracted from its host landscape, and also it's brought something negative to that host community. Now, designing for amenity requires a lot of the same things that designing for biodiversity requires. The book Ponds, Pools and Lochans sets out the following for creating biodiversity: a controlled flow of clean water. It's the same for amenity. We don't want water surging through into a space that a child or even an adult might be in and get knocked over by a massive surge of water flow. Similarly, we don't want people coming into contact with pollutants that we talked about earlier. Structural diversity, as we touched on earlier in the biodiversity section. Similarly, if you apply that to the design for amenity through the SuDS system, we're looking at a variety of features that are maybe treated and planted in different ways to create a visual diversity through the scheme, which will also potentially offer up different functional uses of those SuDS spaces. And connectivity. SuDS creates that ribbon flowing through a site. It may connect the site physically through that water process to a stream or a river, but it also will affect the connectivity of people through a site. So looking at source control equals clean water. Source control is really one of the key aspects to deliver in sustainable drainage. Trying to clean up the water as soon as possible, as soon after it lands on the surface as possible. Without it, we might end up with basins where all that pollution is concentrated. So there will be dirty, high levels of pollution, also litter that gets washed down conventional gullies. So it's not a particularly attractive amenity space. But with source control, that water quickly becomes clean enough that wildlife can inhabit it, and people can use that, can interact with that water without danger. Structural diversity, being creative with our SuDS features. Here we've got what we call a canal and a very dense development in Stamford, where we created a storage conveyance which, due to the very dense nature of the development, we created a hard feature out of it with steps down. So people can go down and access that, look at the wildlife, and actually use the space right down to the water's edge. But in times of storm and rain, that can fill up above the steps, not above the top step, and actually store water and then flow slowly over time. So that SuDS feature there is creating quite a dramatic element within that landscape. Connectivity of a SuDS scheme. If we keep the flow of water at or very near the surface, we can read the way water moves through. Even when there's no water going through, we can see, as this picture demonstrates, there's the rain gardens near Cyprus Dockland Light Railway Station. We developed 4 rain gardens, and the conveyance is all on the surface, apart from where we pass under paths, just for convenience sake, so people don't get wet feet every time it rains. We just drop just underneath the path surface and out again on the other side into that little grass channel. But all the time we can follow where the water goes. It's really clear how water moves through this site. Even when it's not there, it's suggesting the movement of water. And what that means is it's easily understood by the community that surrounds this space. Hopefully they'll actually go out when it rains to see it actually working, to see that water move through these channels underneath their path and filling up the rain garden basins. But also critically, it's easy to maintain. If anything blocks there, it's really obvious what's happened, and it's really easy to unblock. And there's a good demonstration there that as we cross underneath that path, we've actually dropped those slabs are slightly lower than the path surrounding. So even if the aperture underneath the path did block, the water will carry on over the top of the path to its desired location. But the SuDS landscape also needs to be accessible and safe. Not like this. It doesn't mean fences around water features. but more like this. This is one of our schools where primary school, that wetland is designed in such a way that access and egress into the water is easy. If you ended up in that water, it would be easy to get out. Visibility is really clear, so if anyone was in there and needed help, it would be very easy to see that they need help and go and rescue them. So we can design safe spaces with water. We don't need to design away the risk by putting fences around them. So, because I'm a bit short of time, I thought it'd be useful just to look through some examples, some of our work, which really focuses on all the different aspects of amenity, from the sort of wider scale to sort of planning to actually some of the details that actually, to me, also represent amenity, the celebrating the way water flows through a development. So some of our examples, and then I'll move on to some examples from abroad. So this is a scheme we're working with McCloy Consulting for Hammersmith and Fulham at the moment. Australia Road. For us, it's a very exciting project. Really, it's kind of started out life as a SuDS project, pedestrianising a street in White City, but really, for the community, the important thing is what it gives back to them. So we're calling this a community park, or a community SuDS park. And really our focus on design, as well as being very rigorous, and Anthony's doing a lot of work pinpointing how it should perform hydraulically to support the existing combined sewer that it will flow into. At the same time, it's been very rigorous with our flows and volumes. A lot of work is going into basically a public realm design, creating a park for the community. So we're looking at how people interact with this space, how they interact with the SuDS features, what happens when it rains. That on one side of the site is a school, on the other side are two playgrounds. So it was very clear that this was really a space primarily about children and families, and it lent itself so strongly to being a community space. So we created these SuDS basins, which has a wiggly wall for children to walk through. And then we've taken on the right-hand side, you can see we've got aerial channels coming from the school and dropping down into that SuDS basin in interesting ways. And again, ideally, we like to think that when it rains, people will actually go out and look at our SuDS landscapes to see them work, because hopefully interesting things happen and it's quite exciting. Here's a detail of the sort of wiggly wall that children will be able to walk through the basin, weaving in between trees. On top there is a quick montage of the overhead channel showing how it might drop down a rain chain into that basin. And below, some of the details, we're looking at the sort of raised wall around that basin, so people don't just walk straight into it. But how do we get water from the subbase of the permeable pavement adjacent through that nice granite and stone wall into our planted basin on the other side? So it's really a combination of SuDS design and sort of high quality public realm design, and really meshing those two together. At the Renfrew Rain Gardens, it's really easy to incorporate the idea of play into SuDS features. Balance beams, boulders, and at times it gets even more exciting because it's got water in it. It's only shallow water. We're only storing, in this case, probably to about 300 mil depth. It's shallow water. It's got very gently sloping sides. That vegetation will grow up. It will be safe for children to interact when that's full of water, and hopefully it'll be exciting. We like to have fun with the shape of things. Let's make a feature of the way water flows through this space. That is one large basin, but we have a swale running through at low flow to the smaller circular basin at the bottom, which creates quite a striking landscape feature. But as I mentioned earlier, right down to the details, that's a little spout we designed. Really, those little moments where water appears from something and goes into something else. Let's make a feature of those. We always used to do it with gargoyles and all sorts of little ornamental spouts. We're really just recreating those same things, and there's a sort of rain chain on the left-hand side. Ponds don't need to be set in the ground, and ideally for disability access, this is one in one of our schools, ideally raised pools allow disabled to do pond dipping, and we've got a little window there into the pool, so you can actually look through directly into the sort of the aquatic environment. On the left, we've got a sort of large, shallow basin with a swale running through it. It doesn't look like it; it's all so subtle. You can just sort of make out where they've got the woven elements is where there's little bridges across the swale. So when it's not raining, that space is completely usable. It's an interesting space that the children have created those willow structures in. In contrast, on the right-hand side, in a much more sort of tight courtyard space, we created something much more architectural, much more sort of urban. So that's a small basin, a small mini wetland where we've got stepping stones running through. So we've created quite an architectural feature, all still very functional. At Hopwood Motorway Services, we've got the typical water feature beside the visitor centre, recycling that water. We don't have to have standing water on subsystems. It's an aesthetic choice, or it's a biodiversity choice to provide standing water. In this case, it was primarily an aesthetic choice. People like sitting by standing water, and there's a fountain in there too. So sometimes we will look at actually holding some of that SuDS water and recycling it with a solar pump to create a water feature. Just so that, because we know that people enjoy the flow of water, and one of the frustrating things about SuDS is that they only flow when it rains. Unless we store some, make sure it doesn't generate pathogens, and then we can recycle it through a water feature. This is a tiny SuDS example. There's a tiny little rain garden in Islington we did a number of years back now. But it just demonstrates some of the subtle things about landscape design, really. The sort of garden-esque approach. Here we've got, one time of year, we've got the red crocosmia, has a certain character, but a person walks down the street at a different time of year, got completely different vegetation. And that's all part of really landscaping and garden design, is that the changing of the seasons. That's part of the joy for landscape architects, is landscapes are never static. They change with the seasons, they change over time. Over years, trees grow, vegetation develops. Similarly, we enjoy the fact that at times water flows through as a trickle, at times it surges through and we get great cascades and certain features, but at times it's dry. We've heard a couple of times about Lamdrove, Flow's demonstration project. Here, most of the amenity space it serves a double function as SuDS storage or SuDS conveyance. Another one of our schools, this is a bit of a speciality of ours, the swale maze. We make a maze shape out of a swale. It gets a long travel time, so there's a lot of treatment and storage. And the children, when it's dry, the children follow that maze. When it rains, the water follows that maze, and the children can't follow that maze without getting their feet wet, but they can get over the bridges and they can watch the water in that maze. And that, incidentally, was is the school's, as in this case, actually another school. It's the school's, the pupil's favourite part of the school now. In this case, a corner of the school playing field was turned over to SuDS. But as far as the school is concerned, we were creating a wildlife area, which they now use as a forest school. Again, it's their favourite part of the school. Here we see it actually functioning. We can just make out between those sort of balance beams, there is a swale maze running through there, which, when it's dry, is completely accessible to everybody. But the fun really begins when this thing starts storing water and those swale mazes fill up, and the only way to get through that site is over those balance beams. At our Spring Hill co-housing, we've really taken every opportunity to celebrate water within the landscape, using that clean water that SuDS delivers as a valuable resource, as an opportunity as designers to use water as an ingredient in the landscape. So here we've got a raised pool, which is very popular with children and adults alike. They've put some fish in there. In the same development, this is actually, believe it or not, swale, probably the lushest swale I know of. It still functions perfectly, you can't actually see it, but obviously the important thing about SuDS features is that most of the time they're not functioning as SuDS features, they're not conveying water, they're not storing water most of the time. So they need to do something the rest of the time. In this case, this is just a beautiful garden. When it rains, water will flow through that landscape. Yeah. In this retrofit school, beautiful biodiverse swale, taking a kind of finger of a wildlife corridor right into the centre of the school. Not only looks beautiful, but there's a great educational resource there being brought into the school. Not our project, sadly, but I just want to share with you some of the international projects, the sort of projects that inspire us, that we feel do something special with the management of surface water in the landscape. Here at the Oregon Convention Center, creating a sort of naturalistic landscape, emulating a sort of rocky riverbed. And Atelier Dreisaitl do amazing schemes around the world. Here in Oulu in Finland, they've created quite a dramatic landscape, which is really all about the flow of water. Never missing an opportunity to really accentuate and draw attention to the flow of water through that site. By the same practice, this time in Sweden, really interesting features using the flow of water, creating urban spaces, spaces for people to use with a really distinct character, but celebrating that flow of water, using that water as a design resource. Spaces where people can take their shoes off and just dip their feet in clean water running across some steps when it rains. Malmo, a housing development where really the entire landscape character is derived from the use of water, which is fed by surface water. Beautiful, beautiful place to live. Again, a little detail in Malmo, really celebrating the junctions, the flow of water from one feature to another, being creative and playful with the water. Here, these bioretention features are storing and treating polluted runoff on the roads, but it's clear to see how they have brought a new element, a green element into that streetscape, a far more attractive streetscape. And finally, another example from the States. It's quite a subtle one, but that's a little white ribbon wall. Beyond that is a large, shallow storage basin, which will fill up in a storm to a shallow depth, so it's still safe for children to be around. It'll be very shallow. But at the edge of it, rather than just put a mound or a berm at the edge, they just created a low wall. And you can just imagine children balancing along that and people sitting and watching their children play or having a picnic. They just used that as an opportunity to create an amenity feature out of a SuDS feature. So that kind of sums up really what I wanted to get across today. Thank you.
Have you experienced any sort of real killjoys, particularly where the exposed water would be dangerous for children or adults, indeed?
Killjoys, as in people who are resistant to
yes.
our approach to safety around water.
Mostly about safety.
Yeah, very often. I mean, most of our school projects start that way.
Right.
Quite often a council will have a guidance document. I remember one time I either had to put up a it might have been a 2.4 metre fence, or a grill 1 inch below the surface of the water. So that was my starting point. That was what the council required. But I was able to convince them that with the support of ROSPA have changed their tune on the safety around water. And they realised that actually a 1.8 metre fence around a water body is actually more dangerous than allowing people to access that water body. Because I'm going to sound like Bob now, but Bob always uses the example of what he calls Little Johnny. Little Johnny will always get into those spaces. People will get into the spaces they're not allowed to get into. And if little Johnny gets into trouble in that pond, it's very difficult, A, for someone to see that they're in trouble, B, for them to actually get in there themselves to save him. And what we are able to demonstrate is that if you design them, there are certain design criteria for water bodies, gentle side slopes, progressive entry into that water, warning signs so your feet start getting wet, but you can't drown yet, level benches between gentle side slopes, so you've got progressive steps out of the water to get yourself to safety. There are all sorts of design features that make it easy for people to get out of water, but give them plenty of warning when they're going into water, so they have to be very determined to get in there. But there's also, as far as Rossborough are concerned, they're also very proactive in that children need to have an exposure to risks that they can manage, and that's a great example. If we keep children separated from water the whole time, then they don't learn to manage risk around water. And so what we have sometimes done, which is a very useful tool, is actually get Rossborough to do an assessment of a proposal of a water body. And that's normally enough, as long as it's a positive result, it's normally enough to convince a client that actually this is the way to go. And we can show them, we can show them examples of schools where we have done it. We can get quotes from head teachers and teachers saying how wonderful the SuDS scheme is, that they've got accessibility to it. We often come across that problem, but it's rarely insurmountable. In fact, I can't think of an example where we haven't.
Well, thank you.
Can I also just add to that, on the SuDS website, there's a number of schools on there as well, so if you do come across barriers, it's good to give them case studies. And there's also a document there about a framework for managing risk with the SuDS scheme, so it was developed specifically with Rossborough, trying to keep them on board and on side. So if you go to the SuDS website and go to resources and go to the SuDS manual, you should see a health and safety framework there.